Good afternoon or good evening if you're joining from far away. Welcome to another session of this panel on whether South-South relations are unsettling development. This is a panel organized by the DSA Rising Power Study Group. My name is Lydia Cabral. I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies in the UK. So this is, as I was saying, the third and final session of this panel. We've had so far very diverse, very rich conversations on different aspects of South-South relations, from aid to trade, economic cooperation, diplomacy, etc. And this afternoon, the four papers we have in the program will continue on some of these themes. We'll follow the order that I've just copied the list of papers into the chat. We'll follow that order. And my suggestion is that we have the four papers presented in sequence, and then we have a joint Q&A and discussion at the end. So the first paper is 20 years on, are the brittle BRICS unsettling development, a paper by P.B. Anand, Professor of Public Policy and Sustainable Development at the University of Bradford. So Anand, over to you.
Good afternoon. I hope you can see my screen. I'm assuming so, because if I see my screen, I can't
we can see it. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm just switching on my clock. It's a real pleasure to be here, and enormous privilege to see so many colleagues who are working in this field. And in some ways, there is nothing new I can add, perhaps, from this discussion, but it's also a particularly a special time for us, because after more than 6 years, Shailaja Fennell, Flavio, and myself, we were able to complete a book which seemed like a never-ending project as we all get into it, the Handbook of BRICS and Emerging Economies. So that we completed, and it was published earlier this year in January. So in the context, I have been reflecting and thinking about this. So this panel gave an opportunity to extend some of these discussions. I will also reflect on a brief conversation we had with Jim O'Neill during the launch of the book. So it's kind of, in a way, it's extension of the work that is completed, but this is a topic that we are all very interested in. And I just want to touch on some of the kind of issues that we try to raise in especially the assessment chapter that we did in the book. And as we know, the long historical perspective, I think that's sometimes not so recognized, especially in the popular discussions on the BRICS in particular, and also in emerging economies. And a particular phrase we coined, I think, is very relevant for BRICS, the arranged marriage. And every arranged marriage has its trials and tribulations, and I think we'll see some of that also in the BRICS. And in particular, I want to see a little bit about the BRICS symmetry and what we have learned from that, and then paint some of the possible futures in terms of reflections. Of course, the kind of long historical trajectory as presented by people like Angus Madison and others clearly shows us that the idea of divergence is a more recent phenomena. And in that context, we need to situate any discussions of emerging economies within that wider historical narrative. And in particular, our analysis shows that between 1960 and 2015, if we look at the top 30 economies, actually 24 countries remain throughout this period as the top 30 economies. In fact, the table is a bit difficult to see, but G20 economies, the present G20 members, are all there by 1990. And also, if you look at last but one row in terms of the new entrants coming into the top 30 economies, we see very few people, actually very few countries entering this, as indeed few others leaving. So there is kind of very stable group of top 30 countries, 30 economies, if you like. So it is in that context, I think we have to frame or think about the idea of emergence and emerging or rising powers. Politically, I think it's a different issue, but in terms of economic point of view, I think it is a little bit of a challenge to see this. And O'Neill in 2001, in the famous paper, Building Economic Bricks, towards the end, he talks about, in view of the expected continued relative, of course, he was only mainly looking at 10-year period, and he foresaw that perhaps G7 should be expanded to G8 or G9. At the book launch, he mentioned that at the time he thought perhaps Russia and China would be invited, not India. And, it was very interesting. But I think we can see how these kind of discussions and in the book we talked quite a lot about the kind of economic indicators looking at G7 and the BRICS as a percentage of world economy and the so-called convergence, especially in the purchasing power parity. But we also looked at in terms of their contribution to global growth, and also whether there is some degree of convergence. And we see that actually BRICS are still very much at the bottom. So unlike East Asian tigers or the kind of newly industrializing countries which clearly show that kind of structural change, as you would predict from classic W. Arthur Lewis kind of model, and the kind of idea of convergence, we can see that their per capita incomes getting closer to G7 economies, but that is definitely not the case with the BRICS. And we looked at in the book in terms of what explains the BRICS. Is it aid or is it trade? And I'm just skipping this because you all know these arguments, so I don't think this is important. So, and we looked at, in terms of factor productivity and various arguments, and none of these provides a convincing explanation for why BRICS have emerged and to be where they are. Productivity might be an argument for Asian tigers, but definitely not in the case of BRICS. And in case of whether it is savings, again, classical kind of models emphasize on savings, but that I think we may see for China, but not for the others. And foreign direct investment, again, there isn't a great story there. So any of the classical explanations that we tend to think of in a development economics textbook, none of them seem to apply in the case of the BRICS. And of course, for all of us, this CO2 emissions and rising CO2 emissions is a very, very important issue, especially in the context of COP26 coming up. And we see that here also when we look at the per capita CO2 emissions. In fact, in case of China, we can see that the very steep rise from 2000, but for India especially, it's still much lower. So I think it does raise some of the kind of popular narratives into some of the questions. Okay, so from that we kind of said, okay, from this it appears that how they got here is we cannot explain from the classical kind of explanation. There is more to understand. But the arranged marriage is what kind of attracted us to look at. And in particular, we have examined, qualitatively, if you like, looking at right from the first summit until the 10th summit. So the first summit, Ekaterinburg, it was still a BRIC summit, no S there, only 4 countries. And the communique at the end of the summit was only 1,000 words, and it speaks about greater voice and representation in international financial institutions, and their heads and senior leadership should be appointed through an open, transparent, and merit-based selection process. Here, by merit-based, we should assume they're talking about having opportunity for larger economies other than those from OECD countries, perhaps. And then the following year, we have the Brazil summit, still BRICS, but South Africa was invited as an observer. The full complement of 5 of them become a summit only in China in 2011. And then the Sanya Declaration, which was issued there, is by now is 2,700 words. And various priorities were identified for cooperation, but what catches our eye in 2021 is that already in 2011, green economy was identified as one of the priorities. Okay, and then fast forward to a few more years, then Delhi Declaration and also Durban Declaration, both are now expanded much more detail, so around 4,500 words. But we start to see more formal institutions emerging from the Durban Economy Declaration, and then we have the New Development Bank being kind of mentioned there. And then 2014 Fourth Releaser Summit. This is very interesting actually, because this comes at a time when there is a lot of transition taking place within and between also the BRICS countries, and this happens in Brazil. And for the first time, we see in declarations the international conflict being mentioned in terms of Syria. Very clearly, we can see that Russia is already playing a very important role in Syrian conflict. So I think we can see that might be the reason. But when we read the paragraph I have quoted here, that was for me a very ironic part. And it talks about, foreign bribery and strengthening international cooperation for fighting corruption and upholding the UN Convention Against Corruption. And as we remember in 2014, what was happening in Brazil and also in South Africa, the issues related to corruption were at the forefront. So in some respects, it seemed like BRICS were reacting to, on the one hand, their own understanding of having to come together in international cooperation, but the domestic agenda of corruption, and including some of the leaders who were represented at the summits, were themselves party to those kind of corruption scandals. And then we have the following year, the Brazil summit. Again, here, I think I mentioned that. So this one is the UFA Declaration 2015. So by this time, the Crimea and Ukraine, I think, becomes a very important issue. So, but here we see that the declaration is quite long. Perhaps it is the longest declaration so far, 12,000 words, and it includes the idea that universities also start collaborating. Then subsequently declarations get a little bit smaller, but for the first time we have action plans coming as part of the summit communications. And here the ideas for cooperation are further expanded to include local government cooperation, film festival, tourism, digital conclave, and the idea of BRICS friendship cities. It's very much like the twinning arrangements that we have for many cities in the UK. So we can see how this gradually kind of increases. In the book, we have analyzed all the 10 summits, and I just showed here some of the most frequent kind of words that are occurring. But what was interesting was I just looked at the BRICS foreign ministers joint declaration, which was issued at the beginning of June, just last month, this month actually. We are not in July, this month, and that has it's 2,373 words. It focuses on international cooperation in the context of pandemic, and the word that occurs mostly is ministers, but other important words are UN and international. Ministers occurs 35 times, international occurs 26 times, and UN is mentioned 18 times, and global and development, Rory will be very happy to note, they don't necessarily occur all the time together, but they're 17 and 16 times, and system is mentioned 14 times. So that's, I think, we can see how the emphasis is kind of moving. So in terms of looking at possible futures, we talked about, one possibility is that these could become stronger. So we call it BRICS strong. They remain as a closed club, and the cooperation, as we saw, expanding. But this is only one of the several possibilities. The second one, perhaps they could also take a leaf out of G7 and G20 and become slightly expanded with either BRICS 8, for example, including countries like Argentina, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, or also other countries to become BRICS 11, for example. And the third one perhaps is a much wider kind of, a mini G77, if you like, and including, South-South cooperation as the central mode. Already we see that this kind of a meeting was organized in South Africa, where all the BRICS countries were joined by a number of other countries who were invited as guests. And the fourth one, I think, is, as I mentioned in the title of the paper, is what we call the brittle BRICS or brick bears. We already see IPSA cooperation forum emerging between 3 democratic countries within the BRICS. So I think there is a lot of kind of security-related tension between China and India, and China's emergence as a much stronger kind of also financial power then undermines some of the original arguments for having BRICS. Anyway, as a permanent member of Security Council, China needs less help from the others. Perhaps it is the other members of the BRICS who need maybe China on their side. So there are arguments on both kind of directions. So in the wider context, I think this, beyond economic marriage, thinking about and understanding the political ramifications, and even though the statements and BRICS summits mention about upholding things like UN Convention against corruption or etc., how this whole idea of a stable, strong state and rule of law becoming important. I think that's where the tension is, and we see that there are various range of models within the BRICS. China's emergence as a hegemon, as we saw in case of Belt and Road Initiative or AIIB, which is much bigger than New Development Bank, that also kind of creates, if you like, within BRICS, a kind of a challenge for the BRICS in terms of their existence, and the security considerations become even more important when we think in terms of Russia and also its role in Crimea and the continuing Ukraine conflict, and therefore in terms of what kind of negative weight that Russia brings to a potential BRICS kind of legitimacy. And then the wider context of Security Council and UN reforms, I think, also have a significant impact on what might happen. In the wider context, in terms of any international cooperation project, we would expect some kind of a moral argument. In this case, that is one thing, even though here and there in the declarations, the moral kind of argument is raised, we can see that this is an area where BRICS seem to suffer very significantly, and that is an area where more work needs to be done. And I think they are beginning to take this kind of inclusive approaches of G7 and G20, but the idea of summit of democracies and things like that, perhaps again, kind of creates a cleavage within the BRICS. So I think there are very interesting possibilities in this context, and in the discussions with regard to the rising powers that colleagues and we're all researching on. For me, this is a really interesting space to explore further. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks. That's great, and really interesting book. I look forward to read, and nice to see this critique on whether the BRICS have ever risen, at least in economic terms, and your detailed account of the process of the BRICS summit and how that shows the process of maturation of this relationship, but also useful to see those possible scenarios that you highlight there. So I'm sure there'll be lots of questions and comments. You may want to start writing those down in the chat, but let's move on to the next paper. Mask Diplomacy, China's COVID aid and its changing role in international development. So this is a presentation by Yixian Sun, lecturer at the University of Bath, based on work with Bowen Hu at Fudan University in Shanghai. So Yixian, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Lydia. I assume everyone can hear me and see my slides. So this is a paper that I worked with my friend Bowen Yu, who is assistant professor in international politics at Fudan University in Shanghai, last year mainly. So now we are doing a major revision for a journal. So your comments will be very much appreciated. So we started this project because we are interested in China's changing role in the global pandemic, the COVID-19, and we all know China was the first country experiencing the outbreak of the pandemic, was in January, February, and that has received lots of criticism, both domestically and also internationally. But very soon, we can see that some headlines here is like this. Crisis shows China's governance failure, but very soon we have also seen that the Chinese government started to take very strict measures to control the spread of the virus. And it seems that this strategy works well, and China soon be able to slow down the spread. But more interestingly, not within the country, but more like at the global level, we have seen China, because of the role of the country in global supply chains of critical medical equipment, started to provide medical aid or kind of in-kind donations, such as PPE, test kits, ventilators to the rest of the world. Also, I think China clearly show a very strong role in providing kind of also like knowledge sharing about how to control the virus by sending the medical teams. For example, here there's a photo where the Chinese medical teams was sent in March to Italy. So we are interested in this phenomenon, and because this all that China has done at the beginning of the pandemic was not received without controversy from the international community. So there are so many news talking about what's the intention of China behind this humanitarian aid or medical donations. And for example, there are some discussion about whether this is more like geopolitical, and in this case, we could see Xinhua publish these commentaries to defend China's position. So our question in this paper is, has China intentionally leveraged its humanitarian or medical aid during the COVID-19 pandemic to increase its global influence? And because we started quite early our study, so we focus on the first wave of the COVID-19, which ended around the summer 2020. So we didn't follow up what happened afterwards. And so more specifically, we want to look at to what extent the aid that China has provided show the change of the country's international development cooperation policy. So here, just give you a quick summary of our key findings or arguments, and then I'll walk you through the empirical study that we have done. So first, takeaway is that we found that China's medical aid in the COVID-19 largely follows its pre-existing foreign aid policy developed in the post-1979 era, so after the reform and opening up policy. Secondly, we also, through various evidence we collected, show that China's COVID-19 aid is not really guided by a proactive strategy to expand the country's geopolitical influence, but more as a result of defensive and reactionary responses to external criticism and requests. Of course, there's a caveat, because this is our study only focuses on the beginning or the first wave of the pandemic. So there are much more to be debated. Maybe we want to discuss during the Q&A. So what we have done empirically, so what we are interested in is we want to look at where and when China provided medical aid. Here we look at the in-kind assistance by the Chinese government, official assistance, the central government, especially because if it's about the geopolitical motivations, I think our expectation is that it's mainly driven by the central government. And then in terms of the assistance, we look at the equipment donation, the medical equipment donation, and also the dispatch of the medical experts. So we collected data and tried to develop a data set to look at where and when China started to provide aid to different countries around the world. And then, something interesting to just quickly highlight here about the data we gathered. First, it's about the scales. It's quite unprecedented in terms that China does not only provide donation to developing countries, to the global south, but also developed country in global north. And this is also the first time that China has led humanitarian aid in an international crisis. But also we are more interested in the timing of China's provision of aid, because we want to test if the aid was sent to countries where they suffer from the pandemic, the virus. And then we try to also look at what are the content, but we realize this is not possible given the limitation of the data. But one thing to highlight is that we can confirm that there are no country that have no diplomatic relationship with China that received the aid, so which aligns with China's long-standing foreign policy And yeah, just a quick note. So what we did is we look at the official data provided by the government, mainly looking at the embassy, Chinese embassy in different countries to see when and what was being donated or whether the medical team was sent. But then we also triangulate data with the state media, such as People's Daily Xinhua, to make sure the data is verifiable. And then we also use search engine in Chinese and English to make sure we don't miss any other cases. So this is how we develop this data set. And then, yeah, this is just a quick summary. I'll just skip these slides. Talk about what we try to do to kind of like identify the drivers of China's medical aid. So yeah, here we try to do some kind of statistical analysis. We don't really claim that we can find some like causal relationship here, but really to test if there's any like correlations to see what could potentially drive China's aid. So we want to. There are a few like hypotheses we want to test here. The first one is about the needs of the countries, the recipient countries. So in terms of like epidemiological situation. So here we use the number of cases, number of deaths, but also case fatality rate. When China send the medical aid to the countries, and to see if this could be an important factor that influence China's aid decision. And then we also think about the government policy of host countries, of recipient countries, where the countries take seriously the pandemic. And then in that case, if countries started to take strong measures to contain the virus, they may want to have more aid, more equipment, or get more knowledge or help from the Chinese government, and they may make request. So this is kind of like a hypothesis. We want to see if we can get some signs and from our data set. Of course, I think we take into account the state capacity. Here we use the GDP per capita as a proxy measure. And the second type of hypothesis is about the economic and the political motivation of China's aid. Here we're looking at the trade relationships between China and the recipient countries, and whether the country is part of the Belt and Road Initiative, but also the voting behavior alignment with China of the recipient countries. So finally, this is some kind of interesting covariates we added into this model. The statistical model is about whether the pattern, there is a kind of path-dependent pattern in terms of the aid provision in the pandemic. So whether China has provided more aid to countries where that have received already a lot of aid in the past. So yeah, just want to test if there's any like consistency or change. And then here I'd like to show very quickly our findings. Given the time constraint, I don't think I can be able to discuss this in detail. But what I want to show is that we don't really find any consistent pattern. So for example, here the first two column is about the results on the medical equipment donation, and then the third and fourth is on the departure of expert team. And for example, we can see in terms of the seriousness of the situation of the pandemic, we don't see any significant results. So the first row in the first two columns here, although it's significant, but it's negative. So that like more cases is correlated with more aid, and we also don't see any consistent finding with regard to the case fertility rates, but also state capacity. But what we can see here, interestingly, is when we add this containment index measure, which is developed by the Oxford COVID tracker, to show the government's policy to contain the virus, there is a strong correlation between these variables and China's aid, which seems to suggest that if the recipient countries take the pandemic seriously and take and implement strong measures, they are likely to get more. They're more likely to get medical equipment donation or the knowledge or support from the Chinese government. And there's a kind of a request hypothesis here, but I don't think we can really verify. And the other interesting or important thing is here the one I highlight here on the aid, so the past aid. So here we can see countries that have received more aid in the past also are more likely to receive the aid in the current pandemic. And it shows a potential past dependence phenomenon in this regard. But of course, we cannot really see any very strong or consistent pattern here. And this has led us to look at what has the decision-making processes of this of China's aid in this pandemic, and using some qualitative evidence. So we want to see the way in which China provide aid in the COVID-19 consistent or deviate from its past practices on humanitarian aid. And first, to do this, first we identify 4 features that make China's humanitarian aid unique, especially in comparison with traditional donors in global north. And the first one is kind of the forms of the aid. It's mainly, China focused mainly on the material goods and also technical assistance and infrastructure project, but not really to package the aid and have a long-term with long-term systemic tasks. I think in that regard, Chinese aid has been often criticized to be very short-sighted. And the second feature is the avoidance of using conditionalities. And this is very clear that China has this non-intervention principle in its foreign policy. So we can see consistently there is no conditionality in China's aid, at least on paper. And then the third one, it's on the emphasis on actions than less on communications. So more often China has led recipient countries to dominate the design process and to communicate with local communities. So the donors' presence in the project is somehow weak compared to traditional donors. And then the last one is the emphasis on mutual benefits. So often when China announced this project, they also highlight the benefits for Chinese expats or companies. So there is a very strong intention of seeking balance between self-interest and altruism. And this is also the reason for which we often see China has a different definition of aid compared to traditional donors. And with this in mind, we compare China's practices of humanitarian aid in the COVID-19 pandemic. And what we found is there are some consistent patterns compared to what China has done in the past. And first, if we look at how China provide the medical aid in the current pandemic, it still shows some fragmentation of policy making processes, because there are still different government agencies. They are all trying to advertise themselves as important agencies to provide the aid. This include Ministry of Foreign Affairs, also the newly established China International Development Cooperation Agency, but in the case of the health, and there is also National Health Commission here. And this has been reflected,
just to say that you might have not seen my message, just to say that you've completed your 15 minutes. So if you could start wrapping up. Thank you.
Okay, I can't see your...
Yes, I realized that.
Sorry.
Go ahead. And
okay, so let me just finish quickly. And then, I think here one indicator is the issue of the quality issue reported by some Western medias, but there was no clear communication channel to show what's part of the official aid, and what other countries that have officially received China's aid. And also, there was some opposition from recipient countries about the arrival of Chinese medical team. And so also the emphasis on balancing altruism and national interest as well. But the other, at the same time, we have seen also something different in this pandemic in China's medical aid policies. And I think two very important patterns. The first one is like China started to promote more actively the so-called Chinese solutions, the knowledge, the experiences of China, and also about the communication, and also between China and the Chinese government officials and the recipient countries. And I think I'll just highlight these three key findings regarding the logic behind China's COVID-19 aid, and then I think I'll stop my presentation. So basically, what we found from this qualitative analysis is that China's COVID aid is mainly guided as a defensive and reactionary response, but rather than a proactive strategies with a very strong geopolitical goals. And also, there's still a lack of central planning, and the provision has mainly relied on frontline practitioners. And the last finding is looking at the discussion within China, and we still have seen lots of constraints, especially from a public opinion perspective. And also there's a lack of capacity within the government to coordinate the aid policy and to communicate this. So in that sense, I think it's really difficult for China to leverage the aid at this point to seek some geopolitical gains. I think I'll stop here. Of course, there are some concluding remarks, but I want to save more time for the other presenters.
Yes. And perhaps you can come back to some of that in the discussion issue.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks very much for a really interesting presentation. The Western scholarship often presents China as super strategic and coherent, and you're bringing some question marks to that. So thanks very much. So the next paper is by Rory, South-South Pharmaceutical Globalization and the COVID Pandemic. Go ahead, Rory.
Thanks, Lydia. This is going to be an overview of what's a clearly ongoing situation, and it's also going to have a bit of a bias or a greater focus on India, partly because of its significance, but also because it's the pharma industry, which I know best. So if we go back to the general structure of the pharmaceutical industry, in value terms, the biggest pharmaceutical companies are from and headquartered in the United States and Europe, and similarly also the biggest vaccine companies in the world too. When we measure them in dollar terms, these are all companies that are very well known. But this is the typical structure of a pharmaceutical value chain. And when we actually break that down, India and China play huge roles in the global pharmaceutical industry. For drugs, China is a major supplier of APIs, or active pharmaceutical ingredients. Some estimates suggest that up to 70 to 80% of APIs in the world are made in China. India is a major supplier of generic formulations and also of vaccines, known as the largest vaccine manufacturer in the world. And China and India playing huge roles in volume terms, especially because what they produce is often sold as generic products at a fraction of the cost of what is sold by companies elsewhere. So they both play roles as supply chains for big pharma, but also sell a lot of their own finished products and play a much greater role in volume terms than in value terms. And what this underlying structure of the pharmaceutical industry means when COVID-19 pandemic hits is that there's a significant reliance and expectation on a need for supply from China and India, both for for what were initially hoped to be that there'd actually be effective treatments for COVID-19. And there's been different drugs that have, this is probably for many people going back about a year in time now, when these drugs were on a daily basis in the media, with different hype and different geopolitical tensions around them, from hydroxychloroquine and antimalarial to remdesivir to dexamethasone. So hydroxychloroquine, this about 80% of the world's supply is produced in India. IPCA is a major supplier. There was a huge tension when, obviously, or many people might remember, Donald Trump was promoting this as a treatment, but India had much of the supply, and they had a little he had a little Twitter battle, and eventually India agreed that hydroxychloroquine would be continued to be supplied to America a few days after they had actually announced an export ban. There were different tensions around remdesivir because it was under patent. Gilead started running trials on remdesivir. Had actually had an earlier approval for use in the context of treatment of Ebola or against Ebola, and it had no production anywhere in the world in January 2020. But once COVID-19 breaks out, Gilead starts doing trials in Wuhan in early February to see if this drug might have some potential. But it was under patent. Very quickly, some Indian companies started working on potentially reverse engineering it. Anticipating that, Gilead issued 9 voluntary licenses initially, 7 of which were to Indian companies. In order to scale up the production of this drug, companies in India would play a key role. Then dexamethasone also attracted attention as an anti-inflammatory steroid. There's still a lot of debate, not much key actual treatment that is widely agreed to actually work. WHO doesn't actually recommend use, for example, of remdesivir today, but it's still continued very prominently in use in India and in other places for people with COVID-19. So a lot of this, I guess, initially highlighted the enormous role that if there was to be a treatment, India might and was playing in the potential treatment. And very quickly, there's a reaction and a big fear elsewhere of the dependence and realization or accentuation of pre-existing fears about reliance on China and India for supply of pharmaceuticals. The US announces various policy initiatives to reduce its dependence on China and India by promoting local pharmaceutical production. Europe makes statements but has made less signature policy announcements. India also announced greater support because it had become, for local manufacturing, it had become more reliant on China. And this has been a policy agenda for 20 years or more in sub-Saharan Africa, and again accentuated existing uncomfort with the reliance on China and India for pharmaceuticals. Over time, of course, the picture has moved towards vaccines, and in a context where many of initial vaccine supply from big pharmaceutical companies, as understood as Western companies, has been bought up for priority access in Europe and North America. Much of the hopes and expectations of the world, in a sense, shifted to India. There was, of course, also there was some technological reasons too, that Pfizer and Moderna, 2 of the early approvals in North America, are mRNA vaccines, and initial studies only had approvals for very cold storage temperatures where you need a particular cold chain infrastructure that is not widely available in much of the global south. So Oxford's vaccine, which was licensed to AstraZeneca with global marketing rights, becomes kind of the hope of the world. And there was an agreement announced just over a year ago for licensing to AstraZeneca, and in turn licensing of this to Serum Institute of India, the world's largest vaccine manufacturer, with agreement to produce over 1 billion doses by the end of 2021. It's not the only vaccine being produced in India. There's Bharat Biotech's Covaxin and 4 or 5 other vaccines that are still in development. And a massive question emerged initially: while all these vaccines being produced that are likely to be produced in India, who will get access to them? And India had a long-standing reputation as pharmacy to the developing world, or some just call it pharmacy to the world, and a lot of expectations that India would play this role. One of the first statements about who access would go to, the CEO of Serum Institute said just under a year ago, 50% to India and 50% to the rest of the world. Of course, what that statement didn't say is when it would go to India and when it would go to the rest of the world. And the chairperson of India's COVID-19 vaccine task force very much emphasizing that this vaccine is not just for India, but for the world and humanity. And those are part of the conditions that the licensing agreement from AstraZeneca to Serum Institute was. It wasn't just to supply the Indian domestic market, it was, as this tweet on the bottom left says, so that not just the very wealthy few will have access to safe and effective COVID-19 vaccines, but that they would be available elsewhere. And initially, of course, there is exports emerged from India, particularly to neighboring countries. They went to neighboring countries partly first, of course, for political reasons, but they also couldn't actually go to COVAX until the World Health Organization authorization came through for the Serum Institute product and the AstraZeneca product in mid-February. So the earlier was a direct bilateral supply to a number of neighboring countries. What happens then, of course, though, and what's quite well known now, is that although there was initial flurry of vaccine exports from India to neighboring countries from late January onwards, to COVAX from late February onwards, and 60 million vaccines in total by the end of March, another 6 million over the next month or so, there has been none since, as India's domestic COVID situation has escalated in terms of cases and deaths. Exports have been cut off and redirected towards domestic supply. It's now the most recent statement on when a relation to India's supplies for COVAX by Adar Poonawalla was that they hope to start delivering to COVAX again and other countries by the end of this year, and which is an enormous shortfall for COVAX, as I'll just outline in a minute. But there has been, as a result of this redirection of supply, a huge increase in doses administered domestically in India, up to almost 325 million doses now by today. So COVAX, which was in a sense the multilateral initiative to provide vaccines and share vaccines, has had and still indicates that it has aims to supply 2 billion doses in 2021. The first doses came from India, went to Ghana in February 2021, and I think have gone to about 133 countries so far, with just under 90 million doses exported so far. That's as of today. Now, on the chart on the right here is the forecast that COVAX released in late January this year, where quarter one, 145 million doses, quarter two, 640 million doses. So COVAX had forecast to supply 785 million doses by now. Essentially, we're 1 day short of the end of quarter two, 2021. So it's essentially 700 million doses short of its predicted supply. But particularly in understanding the underlying reasons for this, shaded in darker blue is the Serum Institute AstraZeneca product at the bottom of this chart, and then just above that is the Novavax, which is still waiting for approval. And so the more than 50% of COVAX's supplies and plans for this year had been based on supply from India, but only 30 million had been supplied from India as of today, and actually 10 million of those were COVAX supply to India domestically. So COVAX, in a sense, has clearly faced an enormous shortfall because of the changing redirection of Indian supply, which in turn was a result of very poor forecasting and declaration in India that India had expectation and declaration that India had, in a sense, defeated the pandemic and no plan for actually the significant extent of domestic need of vaccines that has subsequently taken place. So instead, many countries have the only alternative source of supply is both China and Russia for vaccines. Sinopharm was approved for general use at end of December, has 1 billion doses planned this year. And although it's only just over a month and a half ago that it received WHO executive use licensing, so the vast majority of its initial supply has been much more on a bilateral basis rather than through any multilateral initiative. And Sinovac's vaccine has also been is very prominent. It received WHO executive use authorization slightly later. Prominent pictures here by presidents of both Turkey and in Indonesia showing how happy they are to get their vaccine from China. Russia was actually the Sputnik 5 vaccine, was the first COVID-19 vaccine to be approved anywhere in the world, August 11th last year, and also the first to be administered in a low-income country with a small number of doses for Guinea. It was also been used in Argentina, in Hungary, Iran, etc. There's big plans for scaling up its production, and some has started supply and vaccination of it on a limited basis in India already, but it's still awaiting WHO licensing. So both India was a planned supply for kovacs, the multilateral initiative, but its initial supply did take place, but it's subsequently fallen dramatically short of its plans. China and Russia, the authorization approvals have taken much longer, and Russia are still waiting. So have stepped up instead with significant amounts of bilateral supply. Just in what's been a quick overview run through, I just thought I'd, as I come to the end, just highlight the scale of current COVID-19 dosage. This is by a share of population who've received one dose. And we can clearly see the UK and America are very high up, but China, for when data is available, is actually at a similar percentage of people who've received one dose. But also the other BRIC countries are significantly higher in terms of vaccines delivered than, for example, Africa or the group of low-income countries, which is at about 0.9% of vaccines administered. Per share of the population with vaccines administered. If we go by country income grouping, actually 2/3 of the vaccines administered to date have been administered in middle or low income countries, and only 1/3 in high income countries by World Bank classification rates. And three of the top 4 countries in the world in terms of number of vaccines administered are China number 1, and then India number 3, and Brazil number 4, with the United States just above India, and India about to overtake United States in the next week or so. So there are enormous, I guess, South-South inequalities involved in COVID-19 receipt of vaccines, which are clearly, in at least in some ways, related to production capabilities. So to conclude, pre-COVID, the pharmaceutical industry had South-South dynamics were enormously crucial for supply. And of course, that then becomes key in the context of COVID-19 treatments and vaccines. The overwhelming route of these supplies is bilateral, some commercial, some on donation basis, rather than through multilateral initiatives where there's been an enormous struggle for kovacs. In the pharmaceutical industry, and COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted this, more than anything, the rising powers are enormously crucial still for low and other middle income economies, both sometimes for good in terms of providing vaccines and if there were treatments, yes, but also for worse in terms of supply dependency, as has taken place in relation to India, and unavailability as many low income countries now face when a rising power such as India meets a domestic crisis and has a political redirection of its vaccine supply. So I'll stop there. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Rory. Thanks very much. Really interesting, detailed account of how the vaccine politics unfolded this year. It's been so much part of our everyday lives. I'm wondering, of course, how much of this relates, the vaccine nationalisms, for example, played out in international spaces like the BRICS that Anand was talking about. And perhaps that's something that we might want to come back to in the discussion. But let's move on to the fourth and final paper of this session, Building Back Better, Analyzing the Role of Value Addition and Digitalization in South-South Trade. So this will be presented by Sanjit, and it's a co-authored piece with Karishma Banga from the Institute of Development Studies, and Sanjit Jain is a research fellow at the Observer Research Foundation in Cambridge. So Sanjit, over to you. And I understand that you will not be turning your camera on because your internet connection is not stable. That's fine, as long as you're able to share your screen.
Yeah, thanks, Lydia. I'll just do that now. Okay, great. Hello, everyone. So Karishma and I wrote this paper as a chapter for a book on South-South cooperation, which is being released by the UNOSSC and UNICA this year. So it's still a work in progress, and we'd greatly appreciate your comments and feedback. So there are 4 major aims of this paper. First, seeing that intra-regional and South-South trade is growing and gaining increasing relevance, we've sought to study value-added trade flows to assess the trends of intra-regional versus extra-regional trade in Africa. And this is an unusual approach and hasn't really been done very much. Secondly, we examined digitalization as a pathway for boosting intra-regional manufacturing trade in Africa. And we also consider ways to navigate the opportunities and risks posed by digitalization. And fourth, we look at how to leverage South-South digital cooperation to boost intra-regional trade and integration in Africa. So manufacturing is a fundamental engine of sustainable economic growth, and Africa's share in world manufacturing value added is only about 2% in 2021, so which is worrisome. And if we look at this graph, we can see that Africa's direct exports are still to the global north predominantly. 42.5% of Africa's total direct exports are to the European Union. And if you look at African value added in third country exports by partner share, you can see that most of the value added by Africa is again embedded in EU exports, which is 62.8% here, followed by the US at 5.5%, so again to the global north. And this value added is mainly in low and medium technology intensive products. Even as far as in 2018, 80.4% of Africa's export basket was low and medium technology intensive products. Now, this is not something that we can take very lightly because the commitment of resources to learning is very costly. And if these resources are committed to low value added technology functions and value chains, it leads to a production lock-in and the accumulation of less advanced capabilities. Antonio Andreoni's research has shown that Africa's integration into global value chains is dominated by and led by transnational corporations, and also forward integration is 60% of its total GVC participation. So firms that have integrated in GVCs have not been able to create backward linkages and produce for their domestic markets. So overall, GVC integration has really failed to create the kind of domestic value addition in Africa that brought about the kind of economic transformation that was experienced by, say, South Korea or Taiwan in the 1970s and 80s. So recent studies have shown us that moving towards South-South trade and integration into regional value chains is a better strategy, and the geography of international trade appears to be moving that way as well. So we'll spend the next few minutes thinking about that shift. Rory and Khalid Nadvi's paper, we've taken that as the base for this slide, and it shows that South-South trade is gaining prominence, and it's grown from 12.8% of world trade in 2000 to 25.3% in 2015. And they've spoken about the emergence of more polycentric trade. Now, there are 2 findings from this paper that we'd like to highlight here. The first is that almost 47% of global manufacturing exports in value terms came from the Global South in 2015. And secondly, that trade in manufactured goods had consistently a slightly higher South-South orientation than in primary commodities. Also, an ITC paper found that in a survey of East African firms, that firms captured 10% more value added in South-South chains and also hired more skilled workers. The second trend we point to here is that value chains appear to be moving towards a regionalization trend. And even in South-South trade, it's intra-regional trade that is more dominant. Now, what's so great about RVCs? RVC's emerging research points to the fact that RVCs boost opportunities for local producers. They're better for economic upgrading. Xiaolan Fu, for instance, has shown that regional value chains in Ghana and Tanzania have been led by mostly local and not foreign firms. And they've been able to produce at greater sophistication and greater economies of scale than other firms that are not part of these production networks. Also, because of cultural links and because of proximity, RVCs have an advantage, and they've been able to create these horizontal linkages and industrial ecosystems around them, which GVCs can't do because they give more prominence to small and medium enterprises. But unfortunately, currently intra-African trade is at a very low 10 to 12%. And even though intra-regional manufacturing exports have increased and are now 34% of total African manufacturing exports, that's still below potential. So we expect that further African integration will help to unlock the industrial potential of the continent, and that is the premise that this paper is based on. Now that we know that South-South trade and regional integration would be beneficial for unlocking Africa's industrialization potential, we have a case study here which shows how intra-regional trade in Africa fares in terms of value addition as compared to extra-regional trade. And we picked the East African community because while being among the most regionally integrated blocks in Africa, the intra-regional trade in this block is very low in terms of trade volumes. And we've done something else that's a little different here. Instead of looking at gross trade flows, we've looked at value-added trade. This is to overcome the problem of double counting, because that overestimates the extent of global participation. And this is also because we believe that developing countries especially need to look at their value added because they run the risk of being locked into low value added manufacturing segments. So here's a quick overview of our method. We've used input-output data from UNCTAD's EORA database. We decomposed gross flows into value-added flows using Leontief's decomposition. We're using 2015 data here, which is the latest available. And then we've calculated forward linkages for EAC countries, which is the domestic value added in foreign exports as a share in exports of the source country. Now, this graph is to show you the sectoral shares in intra-regional linkages on an average in the EAC. So here we find that on an average across the countries considered, agriculture, petroleum and chemicals, financial services, mining, transport services are ranking high in terms of value added by EAC countries in the global exports of the EAC bloc. Within manufacturing, though, you can see most of the domestic value addition is coming from petroleum, chemicals, electrical and machinery. And also as an aside, though you can't tell from this graph, only 1.7% of EAC's total gross exports are related to regional value chains, despite the bloc having prioritized RVC integration. So those are just our findings. And now we've compared value addition by EAC countries in intra-regional trade versus extra-regional trade. So the green bars here are the average forward linkages outside the EAC bloc. The red bars are outside EAC within Africa, and the blue bars are intra-EAC linkages. And the left-hand side graph shows you non-manufacturing sectors, right-hand side shows you the manufacturing sectors. So here we can clearly see that the green bars are just dwarfing the others. So average forward linkages of EAC countries are much, much higher in total extra-EAC trade, and also quite significantly higher in extra-EAC intra-African trade, as compared to these blue bars, which is intra-EAC trade. And this holds across all manufacturing sectors. Now, there's a big difference in value addition, which is observed between extra-regional and inter-regional trade in service sectors, but also in manufacturing sectors. Plus, the share of manufacturing sectors, if you look at the right-hand side graph over there, is on average lower compared to the non-manufacturing sector. The value added is lower. Also agriculture, which is quite significant for the EAC because agro-processing is the lead manufacturing industry in the EAC. So these are again our main findings. And here we have a table which is comparing, just to reinforce that point, it's comparing the compound annual growth rate in forward linkages across manufacturing sectors. And we can see that despite the heterogeneous performance here, like Uganda and Rwanda not doing so well, Burundi, Kenya doing a little better. But on an average, the domestic value added by EAC countries in other EAC countries' exports has been on a decline. Now, we've demonstrated with evidence that the EAC has been experiencing lower domestic value addition intra-regionally, but why is this? The literature suggests that this is because of the EAC's industrialization and harmonization challenges. So given that the international manufacturing landscape is only getting more competitive, the EAC needs more direct productivity enhancing interventions. And we argue that there are very few coordinated regional policies which are targeted at the sectoral level, despite the sectoral prioritization in the EAC's industrialization policy. There are lots of these blanket external tariffs which are not very targeted and are really not being able to do much good. Additionally, we've seen that EAC countries have similar manufacturing profiles, so they view each other as competitors and are not very inclined to align their industrialization strategies. And also, they have better and more long-standing relationships, trading relationships, with extra-regional partners like the UAE, China, and the European Union. And they've even exported more to fellow African countries and other African trading blocs rather than really interact within their own trading bloc. Now, this is also because there's a lack of mutual trust and political misunderstandings. We've had denial of airspace to partner countries, we've had border conflicts, and the EAC also has state capacity problems. It doesn't have great budgetary resources. It's been slow to adopt, some EAC countries have been slow to adopt clear mandates for the implementation of trade facilitation provisions. And also there is, and this is true for almost all economic blocs in Africa, there's an information asymmetry. For example, in a 2016 meeting of the EAC committee, Tanzania had decided that its real development levy would not be applied going forward, but this wasn't communicated to its customs officers. So it continued to persist. So this way, NTBs also persist in the region due to infrastructure deficiencies as well. And there are practical difficulties in reporting these NTBs. Lastly, the opportunity for trade and services within the region also remains underexploited due to high trade restrictions and services within the EAC. And these services are really important because they provide key inputs for manufacturing exports as well. So they're really important for trade in manufacturing trade as well. And these high costs of trading services really constrain trade in goods within the region. And it is argued that if the EAC countries as a group were to reduce their average level of service trade restrictions, Rwanda, for instance, could gain by 13% in its merchandise exports and 20% for Kenya. Similarly, now policies, the EAC bloc does not have policies to leverage digital technologies. In the previous graph, we saw that value added by post and telecommunications was really, really low. I think 9% in intra-regional trade as compared to extra-regional trade. And also there are major shortages in skills and in engineering, IT services, and also these regulatory barriers which prevent foreign service providers from establishing a local presence. Now, how can digitalization help this? It can do so through various pathways. Digitalization bolsters productivity. It enables innovation. It reduces transaction costs. It improves the management of supply chains. But there's a catch. There's a digital divide here. A study by Karishma and Dirk finds that while a doubling of the internet penetration rate increases labor productivity by around 10% on average, this impact is 8% lower for low-income countries, and this has been true for sub-Saharan Africa as well. And
Sanjay, 2 minutes left. Thank you.
Right. So so digitalization also boosts the diversification of commodities and product upgrading. So online trade of 5 Asian LDCs was found to be more diversified and value-added in nature than offline trade. It also helps product upgrading because it can expand your reach, and your marketing can be much more personalized. It reduces transaction costs. You're able to reduce inefficiencies in logistics and delivery. And countries can also capture higher value through digital services. We discussed that before. And also, some evidence has suggested that technology has unlocked non-manufacturing avenues of value added, like industries without smokestacks, like tourism. And Ethiopia has seen that with its floricultural export industry. Also, digital technologies can facilitate new forms of manufacturing, like small-scale and artisanal manufacturing. And now is the time really to do this, because the cost of capital in developed countries such as the US is falling at such a faster rate compared to African countries that we have a very small window of opportunity for African countries to build up manufacturing capabilities in those sectors which are not very prone to global technological changes. We have, I'm not going to go through this, I'll go through this section pretty quickly because we're pretty familiar with these risks and challenges posed by digitalization. The first is a manufacturing divide. So there's a risk of being left behind because of low internet penetration in Africa and also low take-up of sophisticated technologies. There's a risk to employment, even though there's an unclear impact when it comes to employment, but we do know that there's a skill bias that is coming up with digitalization, and Africa is ill-prepared. We do need more literature on this, though, because most of the literature is on advanced countries. Also, as far as the inclusion of SMEs and women are concerned, it's important to note that the benefits from e-commerce and so on have been very limited, even though we had great hope from these platforms. But sellers from very few developing economies can register to sell on Amazon, for example. And also, a majority of these platforms just charge very, very high commission fees. And finally, we have the data divide, the power of these global platforms, which are gatekeepers in the digital economy, and they really are concentrating power at every level of the data value chain. And to counter this, we need a strong competition policy. In Africa, only 23 African countries have competition laws plus competition authorities in place. So we're expecting big things from the AFCFTA in this regard. But the competition protocol and your trade policy really need to go together in order to be able to address this. Now, our final slide is on leveraging South-South digital cooperation and leveraging intra-regional manufacturing trade. And we have 5 policy priorities that we put forth. The first is to strengthen digital connectivity and broadband infrastructure. So this can be done through regulatory policy harmonization. For example, the EAC has launched a one network area to achieve uniform calling rates and has eliminated roaming charges. You need policies that allow infrastructure sharing. So we have, we need MVNOs, like mobile virtual network operators, that allow you to piggyback on other firms and companies' infrastructures. Strengthening broadband infrastructure. China is already doing that. ZTE and Huawei have a huge footprint in Africa. And we have initiatives like India's Pan Africa e-network. Also, the second thing is to strengthen and build soft digital and data infrastructure. So things like, which are foundational to the digital economy, like data standards, microservices, databases. And a survey of 31 African businesses found that all firms, or 100% of firms surveyed, wanted to sell on intra-regional platforms and wanted that digital intelligence that is generated by these intra-regional platforms. So that can be very, very productive for African countries. We advocate regional digital policies, regional cloud computing strategies, and of course the AFCFTA would help harmonize data localization policies. Digitalization can also, South-South digital cooperation can also boost e-commerce and trade facilitation, again through better coordination on cross-border payment systems, consumer protection, and African countries can really learn from each other. This is why South-South cooperation is really necessary here. For example, the EAC has made a lot of progress on having a regional framework on cyber laws, on electronic transactions, and the AFCFTA's e-commerce protocol would also benefit from some preliminary discussion around GATT's mode of supply, etc., between African countries. In order to alleviate financing constraints, we could have southern liquidity funds like the BRICS contingent reserve arrangement. We could have development banks coming together. That's already happened during COVID. They came together to support trade finance providers. But really, in order to be able to help the African Development Bank and the Islamic Development Bank, we need to infuse share capital, and we need the G20, Western donors, South-South cooperation partners to come together and provide supplemental funding. And the last point is to build productive capabilities, which is essential for boosting the technological intensity and value of Africa's intra-regional trade. South-South trade is a very effective route for building technological capabilities in low and middle income countries because of the better complementarity and greater relevance. So it's absorbed faster, these capabilities. And so South-South cooperation could really help by moving from technical to technological South-South cooperation and promote industry-university linkages, the formation of clusters for inter-firm communication. And this really depends on having a good industrial policy. Otherwise, these skilling initiatives done by India and Brazil and all will just really evaporate and not have too much of a broader systemic difference. I'll stop here and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Sanjit, for really detailed, interesting perspective on South-South trade in the African context, and also exploring the potential for South-South digital cooperation, which is very much a new thing. I also invite Karishma now to join the conversation and to add any other insights to what you've presented. But let me now open to questions and comments. So you might want to raise your hand or write your question or comment in the chat. So please, who would like to start on any of the papers? Or a more general comment connecting the four papers. We'll be also asking for reflections on emerging themes towards the end of the session. But who would like to start? Comment on any of the papers? Rory.
I mean, it's not a comment on my own paper, it's a comment on one of the other papers.
Okay, please go ahead.
For Karishma and Sangeet, so I guess I'm wondering about the tensions that come with promoting the intra-regional tensions. So when you promote greater regional integration, clearly different players within specific regions, including in the EAC, are likely to be much better positioned to capture the benefits from that regional integration. And there's also possibilities that it makes the region more attractive to actors and firms from other regions, particularly in Asia, to export to that region, and because it's a single or more like a single market. I'm talking particularly from context of doing research in pharmaceutical manufacturing in East Africa, where manufacturers outside Kenya feel like Kenyan firms will capture the benefits, and if not Kenyan firms, it will just make it even more attractive for Indian and Chinese firms, which are already very prominent in importing to the market, to increase their market share even further. So I'm just wondering about that dynamic of course there can be benefits to regional integration and greater inter-regional trade, but also those tensions about who wins and loses from it. Thank you.
Thanks, Rory. So let's collect a few questions. Who would like to come next? Anand, would you like to just read out your question to Rory?
Thanks. Yeah, I think the very interesting paper. I just wanted to ask if you kind of thought whether this has brought out the interdependence of vaccine manufacturing, which we did not realize. For example, the delays in production in India being held up by logistic kind of supplies from Germany and USA, and now USA's kind of production being held up from India, etc. And the other one is also, if you can briefly touch on the intellectual property arguments being made and whether it should be liberalized and without patent and things like that.
Okay, and so I'll put in a question for you, Anand, on whether you think that within the BRICS we see, to what extent the policies, if you think about policies towards international cooperation within the BRICS, or if you think about bilateral foreign policies by each of the countries and domestic policies, whether you think that perhaps we have a contradiction there. So let's take Brazil, for example, in the current context. Clearly, Brazil no longer, or the current government at central level, no longer presents itself as a southern force, right? So were you able to detect any sort of tensions and contradictions if you pick one of the countries and thinking how this country presents itself in different spheres, and what can we see a pattern there emerging over this long period that you've analyzed? Any more questions or comments before we ask the speakers to respond? Ishian, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. It's just a very kind of quick questions, I think, related to the point made by Lydia on BRICS. So I was wondering, I mean, I think I'm very interested in the concluding remarks made by Anand and also your handbook. So I was wondering what's the research agenda you want to put there? So is there any point to study BRICS together in the future?
Thanks, Ishian. And if I know one from Cynthia, go ahead, Cynthia.
My question is for you, Shan. I just wanted to find out, in your presentation, you said that China's response to the mask diplomacy, or just managing its COVID-19 approach, that this was more reactionary than proactive to gain, I think, some geopolitical gains. Now, I know you said your research was based on the first wave. Do you think that the approach has changed from being, more reactionary to more proactive to make some geopolitical gains now, like this year, with what is happening? Thank you.
Thanks, Cynthia. So that's great. We have a question for each of the speakers. Let's just follow the order in which they were posed. First, Rory to Sanjit. So Sanjit, please go ahead. And then Rory, Anand, and Ishian. And please feel free to comment on any other issues that you've listened to or you'd like to react to. So Sanjit and Karishma, please go ahead.
I'd like to take this one.
Yeah. Thanks, Rory. I do agree with you. There are, definitely tensions and different layers of winners and losers that we see when we look at the intra-regional trade within the EAC as well. I think in just a couple of points, I think bringing the answer together would be that first, when we look at, as Sangeet mentioned, the manufacturing profiles of most of these East African countries, you see that there is big similarity there. So clearly there's a demand side story where countries do think of each other as sort of competitors, and therefore they're not that well aligned with the broader industrialization strategy of the EAC region. So we do see that sort of playing out. And I think the point there would be not necessarily to, kind of curb regional trade, but to look at more towards how you can open up new avenues and opportunities towards diversification of products within East Africa. So I remember I did a study for UNU Wider, which was looking at how Southern Africa can link into South Africa's value chains, and how do you build up the supplier capacities in smaller firms and MSMEs in Southern Africa, so that they can better supply and more competitively supply some of the inputs into South Africa's existing value chains, and also new value chains, that South Africa can diversify into. And I think here digitalization really does hold immense potential, because there is a lot of evidence suggesting that digitalization has led to sort of product upgrading, diversification of products and movements towards better sophisticated products. And increasingly, there's also research which has shown that one of the key factors that drives domestic value addition in foreign exports or forward linkages is actually intangible capital, which could be economic competencies, computerized information, as well as R&D and organizational capability, and the whole set of intangible assets or capabilities a firm has. So again, those who are able to develop those capabilities, are better placed to capitalize on the opportunities and to link and upgrade more in RVCs, while the ones that don't will tend to lose out. So I do agree that there are definitely winners and losers, but I think leveraging digitalization there to boost diversification into these value chains is sort of more the approach that we're trying to take in the paper.
Sanjit, would you like to add?
No, I think I'm good. Thanks.
Thank you very much, both. So now, Rory.
Okay, thanks. I think the interdependence of vaccine manufacturing, in many ways, this has been in many ways a major beneficial aspect of global value chains in the context of the pandemic. Is in some ways the interdependence they involve actually reduces the extent to which political, I don't know what to call it, wars or nationalism can be pursued to some extent, because if a country is dependent or interdependent with another for something else, if it cuts off supply of one thing, to another country, then it's also going to reduce its own supply of some other input that it needs to produce something for itself. And I know there's been 10 years of fears in America about reliance on China for inputs of certain pharmaceutical ingredients. And Lantian Li, a colleague who works in pharmaceuticals in China, who's doing her PhD at Northwestern, we've talked about this, and she said that it's very one-sided, the fear that, at least, I don't know, but that anyway, it's much more on the US side, and there's nobody in China that's really threatening to actually cut off pharmaceutical supply to America, and it didn't happen either in the context of the pandemic, and if it doesn't in the context of this pandemic, it's hard to know what would. I think, inputs have held up, certainly, and including some vaccine production in India, but I don't think it's anywhere near the key reason, for example, why India's vaccine production has fallen short. Some of the more recent shortfalls have been for the Novavax vaccine, which is still awaiting regulatory approval. The intellectual property issue gets the media attention, activist attention, and of course, historically, lack of IP protection has played a key role in increasing access to antiretrovirals, most notably, where India played a key role in increasing access. But vaccines are technologically different products from drugs, and so I guess I put it this way: even if you had a TRIPS waiver that's being proposed now, if only that was the only thing that took place, I would be very surprised if it actually really made any significant role in increasing vaccine supply in the next 1 year or two, because simply put, it's not very possible to reverse engineer vaccines in the same way you can reverse engineer drugs. It would basically be like almost starting the vaccine development again. You'd have to go through regulatory trials and approvals from the very beginning, and it's a much, much slower process than involving the cooperation of and cooperative tech transfer from the original vaccine developers. So those advocates of the TRIPS waiver who also claim it's more justice, the TRIPS waiver, while kovacs' charity, are actually, to me, advocating a route that is very unlikely to make a difference for the foreseeable future, and could actually putting the eggs on TRIPS waiver over kovacs. Of course, they're not one or the other, and there's no reason why you can't support kovacs and have a TRIPS waiver. But I think direct donations and vaccines for kovacs are the much more likely to increase supply in countries that are really left with very short of vaccines in the immediate to next number of months coming.
Great, Rory, thank you. And Anand, would you like to respond to the two questions?
Yes, thank you. I think this is Lydia, your question is really very interesting, because at all times, I think these countries do have that contradiction, because it depends on the audience who that they are trying to address. So there are also times we see between 2005 and 2019, if you like, in terms of the currency or the advantage that they can get by portraying this kind of, we are part of this, we are building this kind of a global alternative institution, that also varies from time to time. So there are times when that has advantage, domestic advantage, then you kind of see that, for example, Dilma's case, when her own popularity was, being shaky, this kind of summit is used as a way of legitimizing. And we see the same with Jacob Zuma, for example, using, the Durban summit as a way to kind of bolster that, look, we are very important, we are having this kind of a power to invite Russian and Chinese leaders and, hold this kind of summit. Whereas more recently, I think we see that actually, the number one, it's an arranged marriage, and therefore, and number two, all of them have their own kind of independent priorities. So intra-BRICS trade is actually very minuscule compared to their overall trade for each of those countries. So that being the case, interdependence among them is very limited. ASEAN is very different because there is a regional kind of a dimension which provides the justification for coordination and cooperation. Here, there is absolutely no reason for cooperation. That's why we call it an arranged marriage. There's nothing, very little in common, neither cultural ties or any kind of, border, yes, you can say between India and China, and then China and Russia, but Brazil and South Africa, they're connected, and no common colonial past, or nothing. There is, if you take a long perspective, there's nothing to connect them. So I think that is, in some respects, that is the surprise that, first of all, that such an organization has emerged. And that is where the answer to Asian's question is also there. So, we have just published a 1100-page book, and if BRICS were to dissolve tomorrow, our enterprise would have invested. I think there is still some momentum. I think they do understand that there is, in spite of not having so direct mutual self-interest, I think they do recognize that there is some, advantage in having. So we think that this will continue, but the direction it will take in future depends on the next 2 years. I mean, if you look at this year's summit pictures, in India is supposed to host 2021, and if you look at the picture, the main picture that you will see is Prime Minister Modi addressing the people of India. It doesn't show other four leaders. It doesn't show that it's an international summit. It just shows Modi is addressing, population of India, because I think with the border tension between India and China, I think the legitimacy of BRICS as presenting this as a kind of a success story becomes much more challenging. So I think you always see this kind of these politicians being very, very careful in presenting and recognizing the tension between domestic versus international agenda, foreign policy agenda, but also kind of being flexible and adaptive to the context from time to time. So as Rory mentioned, early on in the COVID-19, in terms of when India was shipping, dexamethasone, etc., to Brazil, the BRICS kind of dimension was mentioned briefly, and China was giving a lot of PPE to India, and then the border conflicts, and tensions rose. After that, we don't see so much about, especially India-China cooperation. Still, PPEs are coming into India, but it's not presented. It's very, very carefully kind of, kept very subdued. So I think, these things are very interesting. And then India accepts Sputnik, but it hasn't accepted the Chinese vaccines. So again, there are those kind of diplomatic dimensions there. So I think both questions definitely raise this issue in terms of, I think, whether BRICS dissolve tomorrow doesn't matter. I think there are lessons to be learned with regard to rising powers and emerging economies in terms of, what are the challenges for promoting this kind of international cooperation beyond kind of a Mankur-Alsonian logic of collective action, kind of an approach. So that's what I would say. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anand. And finally, Xian, on Cynthia's question.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. A great question, also a very difficult question. So to answer this one, I'm not sure if I'm in very good position to answer, or if I can fully answer, but I try. And to answer this question, I would answer it at two levels. So first, I think just like regarding specific issue or global effort to combat the pandemic, I think many actions or like even statements from China is still quite reactionary. For example, we talk about the masks, but then now we move to the stage about vaccine. A lot of statement it's about reaction to the international calling into question of the effectiveness of Chinese vaccine. So also it's just to follow up the commitment that the Chinese leadership has made to the global community. So I wouldn't say it's like at a different level. So different, just in terms of strategic importance of these activities. It's just kind of like follow up what China has started from the pandemic. And the other thing I think I want to remind is like these kind of like issue linkages to linking like, for example, the medical assistance to other issues, geopolitical issues, very difficult in China, mainly because of the fragmentation within the government, even like at the very central level. So it's very difficult. So, for example, for those who provide aid or do work on the ground to link the issue or tie the issue to like geopolitical situation. So I think this is something we have to bear in mind. But then if we look at another level, a higher level, think about the broader, big picture question or broader context of global power transition. Of course, I think China is taking like a stronger position and try to be more proactive, try to introduce reforms of global governance. I think this has been done through many initiatives, especially like Belt and Road Initiative. So I think it's just like a natural trend that China, I think Western observers want to see Chinese policymakers become more assertive. I don't like that word, but I think it's just like a very normal trend that China want to be more active and be part of the decision-making table. So I think we need to be a bit more nuanced, in my opinion, and when we study different issues. This is just my simple answer.
Thanks, Yushian. I've had that situation of wanting to use assertive and being pushed back by my Chinese colleagues. And sometimes I wonder whether it's a translation issue, whether assertiveness perhaps translates even, it's even stronger if translated into Chinese. I don't know whether there's a translation issue, but there's clearly an issue about how to portray China. And I think big question marks on whether we can talk about China as a one coherent force, right? As you were discussing. But we have a couple more questions for you from Hui. One. So she says, in organizational studies, scholars look at why firms, NGOs locate in certain places. And there are three mechanisms: needs, convenience, and politics. It seems you covered needs and politics in your model. And she wonders whether convenience factors should be taken into account. For example, ease of transportation, geographical distance. And then a second question, you were comparing the pre and post-COVID situation. Is your comparison based on your, primary data, your own research, or based on the literature?
Okay, should I respond now or want to take a
Yes, please, why not? Go ahead, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think on the first question, so what we look at is whether we look at the final destination of the aid, so it doesn't matter where it transferred to. So even like in the case of some African countries, the shipment was first sent to a certain country and then transferred to other countries. But we try to trace down to make sure that we know, so in the database, so we know where the aid was sent, where the assistance was sent in the end. But maybe something, I want to, maybe I can't fully understand this, but if you have some thoughts or suggestions, I'd be happy to talk with you bilaterally. And then the second question, the COVID characteristic is mainly based on the existing literature. So I think there are a lot of studies on China's aid policy. And when we look at what China has done in the current crisis, is we look at the policy documents and also the media reports to show the evidence and how this aid has been made and what are the problems which could give us some kind of evidence to show the decision-making process behind. Of course, we couldn't do any like interviews, for example, with decision makers because of COVID, but also I think it's quite difficult to do this this kind of research in terms of primary research. But I think this is something definitely we need to do more in the future.
Thanks, Xian. Let's see if there's any more questions or comments. If not, I wanted just to remind us of the two questions we started with, right, for this panel. So there was a question about how South-South relations have been impacted by multiple pressures, and there's been lots of insights on that. And then there was a second question on the potential for South-South relations to contribute to building back better or differently, or in a transformative way. And I think perhaps we have less answers on this second question, right? So I wonder whether anyone wants to share a reflection on whether we feel we have something to say on the potential for South-South relations to contribute to a different system, particularly thinking about a developmental, more inclusive, fair future at different levels. Of course, we talked about various different things: pharmaceutical trades, economic development, technological exchanges in relation to various aspects. So I guess it's a very sort of broad notion of development. But can we say something about the potential for South-South relations to contribute to build back better? Anyone wanting to share a final reflection before we come to an end?
I have a quick thought, but maybe not to answer this question. But I really like this question. But my feeling that I heard a lot about building back better, but in the northern context, but not really in the global south context. I was just wondering why we never thought about or try to explore the role of South-South relations, or even just like emerging powers in this discussion. So I think this is it's to me it seems like it's really like a discourse driven by northern countries. So I think this is just a quick thought. She's frozen.
Lydia.
And do you want to come in while we're waiting for Lydia?
Yeah, I agree with Xian. I think looking back at the 2008 financial crisis, and in 2009 and 10, I was doing some field work in India and also in the Caribbean. So initially, before going at the time, I was, because here the narrative was about, insecurity and state support and unemployment, etc. And then you go there and then you kind of, start your fieldwork with, how has the financial crisis impacted, India? And then they were like, what crisis? What are you talking about? So, I think, you're right. And sometimes, the idea of build back better can sound very, very foreign and very artificial if we are talking about, especially in certain southern contexts. For emerging economies, I think the link is much clearer, and but I think the narrative of build back is not yet there, because as Rory mentioned also, and if you look at the Johns Hopkins data, still I think the pandemic is very much in progress in especially Brazil, India, and to some extent Russia. And China is different. I think that's again one of the stories with regard to BRICS and the divergence within the BRICS. So the South-South cooperation, I think it has also exposed, if you like, the dependence or trustworthiness of long-term interactions and things like that. So that's why your positive correlation in your regressions, Yushan. I think it's not surprising in the sense that, so if you have had more aid relationship over last 10 years, then, you know, your immediate response to send more PPE to that country, I think is expected. But I think in some ways, this is very interesting. So India, which arranged a meeting 2005, invited all the aid donors and told them that we don't need your aid. And then 2021, you know, we talk about India receiving or welcoming aid from Germany and things like that. So I think, you know, it has really unnerved. So it's not so much as build back better, but I think it has really shaken trust in many, especially bilateral relationships and even international organizations. So I think there is still a lot of work to be done on trying to understand how this kind of trust, more trust-based international, organizations can be built. I think that is an area where there's a huge amount to be done. That's what I would say. Thank you.
Lydia, I have one question before you stop to ask Anand, actually, now that my brain is finally working after his presentation. We were just working on a policy paper for the Indian government, me along with a few people, on how the BRICS presidency should be handled by India. And we sort of came to the conclusion together, this is for the Think Tanks Council, that only if we were to consolidate the agenda a little bit and, focus on building back better, and all of this proliferation of international institutions and how BRICS should support international institutions and comment on Syria and Iran and Palestine, if all of that were just to be, a little more focused and consolidated, then the BRICS could actually do really great things. So what do you think about that? Are we way off on that?
Rory, shall I answer?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I think you perhaps are closer to Indian position on this than perhaps I take a macro view. I think the tension is very clear. So there are kind of bigger goals driving the BRICS agenda. Those are much more long term. So that is to shape the international organizations. And I showed the very first statement, Ekaterinburg's statement. And from there, that resonates even in the June 2021 foreign ministers. The statement is all about how we have to change the international order and international institutions to become more inclusive, etc. UN is the second most prominent word, I think, in the international. The ministers I left my list somewhere, but I think the most frequent word was ministers, so that is understandable. It's a foreign ministers conference, kind of communique 35 times. But the second most prominent word was UN, I think 26 or something like that. So that suggests that is still very much part of the kind of what makes BRICS stick together. But I think your positioning is absolutely spot on in the sense that there is a danger of trying to put in everything, and it becomes some of our audience would be familiar. There is a dish in India, it's called khichdi. You put everything together, there is no just put everything together and just cook it, so it can become it can become like that if you put in shove into. So I think having a focus and having kind of action plans are emerging. So I think having too many action plans, I think that's what creates a problem. So, and then nobody can say whether there has been any tangible outcome or something. So I think having a balance between these two is extremely difficult, because at the end of the day, it's a political project. So the political project wants to project about challenging IMF and challenging international order, etc. What the BRICS countries originally called the merit-based international order or something like that. So I think it's a real struggle. So heads off to you.
Thank you.
It doesn't look like Lydia's coming back, but yeah, I mean, on the building back better, it almost seems like there's two things. I mean, and also interacting with and teaching some students that have been in different parts of the world during this year, it's been So a PhD student in Togo has kind of been like, well, it already is normal already on the one hand. And then of course the vaccine situation, and India has already declared being normal 4 or 5 months ago. And then it's clearly not normal. And then it goes back to normal and then another wave. And similarly in the UK, it keeps going in and out of closer to normal, back to abnormal. But the vaccine situation clearly means that it's quite a long time before that, but I think South-South relations are even key to get to the point where it can be any kind of whatever to get to a post-pandemic stage. South-South relations are going to be incredibly vital for that, and in both anyway positive and negative ways. But in your analogy, Anand, with the financial crisis, all of the kind of economic trade data just shows, the stagnation in the north following the financial crisis, but the continued massive growth of whatever you call it, emerging economies, BRICS, South-South trade, has been the key kind of dynamic area of the post-financial crisis. So yeah, it will be interesting to see whether that plays out the same way or it's even more China dominated now. But
yeah, I think you're right. I think this time early indication, the data is still coming, but early indications are that I think, it's at the moment it's China dominated. Obviously we can see that Brazil and India were significantly affected. Growth forecasts are very, very kind of, significantly lowered. And Russia, anyway, I think, even previous financial crisis also, it did not have such a big impact. But I think, so overall BRICS together and emerging economies as a whole, I think this time are much more coupled with what has been happening in the OECD economies than in the financial crisis. So this time, I think unlike in the last time, the recovery is likely to be much more coming from OECD economies themselves. So therefore, goes back to Ishian's kind of previous kind of comment. So in that sense, build back better by OECD economies, I think is going to be really, really important. Even though it may not be relevant to some of the countries in the South, but I think for global economy as a whole, I think it's going to be very, very, very important. And not only in terms of the shape, but also in terms of whether it's going to be more green, more climate friendly, and all those kinds of things. So maybe that is where, again, another area where countries in the South have much more role to play, because they're much more kind of in an advantageous position with regard to climate impacts compared to growth in the North. So, but we need to see more collaborative approach, which we don't see yet. So that's where is the worry. Each individual country is talking about build back better, but what we need is a, kind of a much more open and collaborative build back better that we don't see yet.
Well, the UK is clearly only trying to build itself back. It's not really trying to build anybody else back, and many other countries are the same, I think. But I'm almost curious to do an informal survey of how many more people, if anybody's following football today, whether more people here are supporting Germany or England. In terms of people's anyway.
Yeah, we still have time. We have another hour.
Yeah, it's more a poll of anti-colonial feelings and mindsets, and whether people have more sympathy with Germany, which probably anyway, because I don't think many people come here from country. Well, no, I don't think anybody comes from a former German colony. But many people come from former English colonies. Anyway, nobody has to say anything on that. Probably that was a unprofessional comment to make. Nobody knows what to say. But anyway, thanks so much everybody for all the contributions throughout the 3 sessions. I hope we can all. I think there was a lot of it. Well, some of it. I know obviously it would be great to meet in person, but there was also to have different new people involved, including people who may not have made it physically. So hopefully we can, I don't know, anyway, continue the conversation. And if anybody wants to get involved in the Rising Power Study Group, we talked for those who weren't at the business meeting last week about maybe trying to organize a couple of webinars, well, maybe a small number of webinars through the year on different issues, maybe like different people taking a lead on different ones. So, for example, I said I might try and organize one on vaccine diplomacy and the BRICS, and there were anyway different other. If anybody was interested in even just suggesting a webinar, and then we can promote it through this and bring in different other organizations and networks we're affiliated with, I think it would be a good way, and not too much work if it's just sort of one webinar per person, or a couple of people coming together to team up in a webinar. It seems like it might be a nice way, so it's not just waiting until next year for something. So anyway, feel free to send myself or Lydia an email, but hopefully we'll all interact other ways in the meantime.
Thank you, Rory.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lydia. Yeah, let's keep in touch, definitely.
Yeah. Thank you. I think the panel has been, you have really thought very carefully in the call, and, that's why you attracted such wide range of papers. So thanks to you and to Lydia for putting this panel together. And I'll be very interested to help organize maybe one such event in the coming years. So I'll liaise with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing where I know you mentioned your book launch a few weeks ago, but if we thought more about that, we actually could have. Anyway, partly it's been so busy and chaotic in different ways, but we can actually, those kind of things are great to promote amongst this thing as well. If there's something related going on that somebody has, that we can actually attract a kind of audience of people in different places. So, yeah.
And maybe also next year we come back to offline activities.
I think maybe hybrid.
Yeah, but of course
hybrid or hybrid conference, but also for those of us in the UK, it might be more easier to meet and so, yeah.
So we can organize seminar or like workshop, and then or like just presentation, we can always record and share with other people who can join.
Yeah, we did that with the study group in 2018 and 2019, one at LSE and one in Sussex. And then there is some money, a small budget for that, but it covers largely people's travel within the UK. So, I mean, now we're obviously more familiar, able to bring in people from online who are not able to be in the UK, because the budget for these kind of workshops doesn't cover that at all. But I mean, especially for the theme of this workshop, it's great to have people based in other countries. Or the theme of the study group, sorry. It's great to have people based in other countries too. So yeah, anyway, let's hope it's, maybe watch this space, and there'll hopefully be some stuff, but definitely keep in touch and keep ideas. Happy to talk about them if anybody has any.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Yeah, great job to put all these panels together, and let's have a good summer break first, and then we can think about what to do next.
Yeah, and good luck to Germany.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.